Hell yeah, it's Friday and it's Future Crafting Fridays. And we're today with Marc Morissette, who's been in the creative and VFX industry for quite a while,
Quite
probably a bit longer than myself. Marc, so good to have you.
good to be here, Patrick. Thanks for inviting me.
We're going to talk warts and all today, but before we get into the crew, which is how studios make the final impact, I wanted to ask you, do you remember your first experiences in the VFX industry?
I have quite a few, but my first really experience was doing a television series, which was called Excalibur. And that's straight out of an ad. I actually went into this 3D lighting. It was basically a full crew with some experienced artists, but mostly students straight out of school. And that show was a really good experience because it was a year and a half in full CG animation, keyframe animation, lighting, and compositing all. So we had all the departments trying to output 30-minute shows and learning as we were building. I was straight out of school. It was actually that kind of experience, and it was great. But my love was really into compositing with Flint, Flame, and Inferno back in the days. Yeah, so that's how I first got my job in 3D animation and
That
VFX.
was, I guess, that was after you worked at Discrete, right? This
Yes,
doesn't
yes,
count as the experience, but maybe as a taster.
yeah.
For those who don't remember, Discrete is a company that was behind 3D Studio, which is now called 3D Studio Max, and properly, I guess, Autodesk 3D Studio Max, right?
Yeah.
That's the path it
Actually,
took.
that was before that 3D Studio Max was bought. So it's early days at Discrete. And that was in the marketing department as I was a student at the NAD Center. But yeah, it was basically a marketing call center. So I would call, East Coast all the way to the West Coast and calling clients for events and stuff. So I would practice my English and practice my client relations.
Well, that's quite a start because I believe that everybody who works in the creative industry should get a start, in the marketing roles. And cold calling, it gets no harder than that, I guess. So afterwards, probably marketing your studio would not be much challenging.
Well, it was still challenging because the your involvement and the relation is different than just, cold calling. It's still, a facility and you still need to do it, but it's a different relation when it's for you and your company and you know that if you don't call, well, you won't get any contracts. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
So, well, this is pretty much what happens when you start running your company. And, well, you gotta run sales and you gotta run marketing. And, well, the reason I mentioned that is like many people get into creative industry coming from the creative angle, meaning they are good with creative, but they have absolutely zero business experience and absolutely zero marketing and sales experience. So, like, entering the industry from that angle is a huge, well, booster, I would say.
It does help, but there's still that, again, especially since I was a really creative and technical person, going into entrepreneurship was really about, okay, well, there's so many hats you need to wear and you get to learn as you're doing it because, there's no actual book that says exactly how like your own business is going to go, even though there's multiple companies that you can look and try to get a sense of how they're doing it, but it's still it's individual experience. It's a personal
Right.
experience that you
Yeah.
get.
So when you started Cluster, that was 2015, and you were probably a good decade in when it comes to the FX industry, or like 12, 15 years, something like
Yeah,
that.
something like that. Yeah.
With the experience of having worked for Sony ImageWorks and for Digital Domain and a couple other quite established studios. So what made you do this shift?
Actually, it was the last studio I worked before starting Cluster that I was thinking about the possibility of starting. I was freelancing a bit at one point, but I was really looking into, what? I would love to have certain relationship with, my employees in the event I would get employees also there's things about I always got this lead or follow vibe to so basically I'm a very good follower if the person in charge is really looking really long term, really towards something that I wasn't aware, and try to get a sense of, okay, well, that's a good direction. I love the direction we're taking, and I'll be a good follower. But in most cases, I was like, you know what? There's a lot of micromanaging that I didn't
Hmm.
like in multiple companies. Not to say that they're bad individual, but micromanagement was one of the biggest issue that I had with companies at the time. So I basically decided, you know what, I'll give it a try and see how it goes. And yeah, so that's how I started Cluster.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because guess what? I'm probably myself also guilty of quite a lot of micromanagement, probably more than I should have done. And I guess, well, there's two of us already, right? Well, I don't want to sound accusing, but did you take it over to your company, or you were doing absolutely zero micromanagement in Cluster?
I wasn't doing micromanagement, but basically I was also a teacher. Like I love to teach. I love the personal experience that a artist in VFX is going to get. So I love to take people under my wing. Goal that they fly by themselves. So I'll
Hmm.
take an example. I was working at a company on a project, and at one point there was too many projects at the same time, so I had to delegate, which was hard for me. But at the same time, I'm like, you know what? I don't have a choice, so I delegated, let's say, look dev, and I really loved the experience because I split with all the artists involved. I think we were 4 or 5 in terms of comp, and we were getting layers from CG, and I basically told them, you know what? Do your own look dev per shot, and we'll meet. It was so fun to do because everybody was like putting in elements, and when we would do dailies, I'm like, this is fun. I'll do that for my shot. And people were just like upping the game with no effort because
Hmm.
everybody was like putting their own grain of salt. So when I got that experience, I was like, you know what? Cluster was the same as taking people under my wing. And I really noticed that the key employees were the ones that would love to learn new stuff. If people were set in their ways, it's really hard to progress as a company in
Hmm.
at the speed I wanted. So I'm guilty about certain things, but yeah, it's the learning process that's really important for any employee, any company. Like if people sit and it's stagnant, that's why it's important to have a leader that's welcoming that
Hmm.
approach, because you need room for the people to grow, and you need the input of those people who are actually doing the work, which is crucial, hard to do. Again, I'm pretty sure it's hard to give those people an actual platform to have them like grow, but it's limiting if you're not doing it as an entrepreneur, because at one point you can have a what you might call it, not dead weight, but it's going to be hard because you're like, okay, go, 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 but nobody has the same drive as your own self, because it's your baby, your company, so you need to motivate people to actually be with you on this journey. It's yeah.
Gotcha. Well, it's interesting because I think that I totally relate to teaching experience, and I'm not sure about you, but well, probably if you were 10, 12 years in a game and you were a small studio, you weren't hiring, the like high hitters, right? These were probably intermediate level people or maybe even juniors, and you need to elevate them quite a lot. That's the case with my companies. At the same time, obviously, there is this hiring people, making them punch above their weight. But at the same time, you have the entrepreneur and head of company responsibility, and you need to deliver, make your clients happy. And at the same time,
Exactly.
the bottom line needs to work pretty well. And you probably have also your goals in terms of like artistry and craft level. I don't know for you, I've been a perfectionist for probably a bit too long. What's your experience with that?
It's funny because there's a few lessons I learned while back in California in terms of perfectionism. since it's a show, that's what I learned is, it's the director's show. So basically anything below that person who's the final decision maker slash, probably the producers or whatever. But I learned really quickly that what the client wants, especially in our field, is to get the entire show in front of the entire group of shots in front of them so they can actually see what we're doing, what we're making. So for me, it was really important to say it's the entirety of the show that needs to be in front of that person. And at that time, it was like one studio, one show. I
Mhm.
basically felt like I was in VFX when the transition went from one studio and they started to split
Yeah.
sequences and work. So, but it's really about getting all the shots in front of the director as soon as possible. And for me, in terms of perfectionism, a lot of time they would spend 3, 4, 5, 6 months on one item to get it perfect. But the problem is there's more assets or
Mhm.
shots to be built other than that particular one element. So, and then you need to even out the quality of the entire show. And it's for me, my approach with Cluster was really different. It's about getting the show done in the budget that they had, which is, and as a perfectionist also myself, at one point you're trying to get as much as you can. It's rarely about the money. Like as an artist, you're basically, I'm gonna try to get the best pending out for them. But it's not always like you're limited by time, you're limited by money. It's you've probably seen this on internet. The guy is drawing like a 1 minute Spider-Man and then a 10-minute Spider-Man and then 100 hours or whatever, an hour a Spider-Man. Well, it's not the same quality. It's the same artist. They'll get it,
Yeah.
but it's a question of time and money. And that's a crucial element that I was trying to follow while at Cluster.
So at Cluster, what was the like dominant kind of work that you guys were doing? When you say show, what do you mean by that?
For us, it was mainly a compositing work, but through that, since I had a CG background, I sometimes would get one or two shots that required CG that we would bid and try to pull out just to have our like studio comfort zone grow a little bit and get those elements out. Basically, it was I remember getting a Netflix show and a few other stuff, and it was mainly local shows like in Quebec, like small independent films or television series. But I was
Mhm.
actually happy with that. My dream was to build the team, which I did build all the way to the amount of people I wanted, the type of show we were getting. But suddenly it crashed.
Oh no, you mentioned that.
Oh, sorry.
Now we'll have to transition and change the subject. Anyways, before we
No worries.
get there, how many people did you have at the peak? Was around
8.
10, 15? 8.
8.
Okay,
Yeah.
right.
And the reason why I wanted to keep a small team is the way I designed the studio since the beginning and was really a very efficient way to work. And I remember my brother Tom, which was a producer for the cluster. We did a contract at a studio, and he was like, it's working well, this and that. And I'm like, you haven't seen the full spectrum of how we're handling stuff, on my side. So we went in and he's like, oh my God, just the turnaround of shots and the way I was doing stuff was so efficient
Mm-hmm.
that it was like, my God, why aren't people doing that in terms of
Gotcha.
it's the whole process of getting the client, the shot goes in and out and how you're doing the whole process. So yeah, it was doing great basically.
My studios, like at least Kizny Visuals, which was my last and biggest chapter, probably I always had this like mental limit of 15 people that I never wanted to cross. And
Yeah,
that's simply because of the fact that it would require a change of model and hierarchy. When you're above 15, 20, you need hierarchy. And we
yeah,
were always a democratic company with flat structure, no hierarchy except me being the badass sucker kicking everybody's asses. But hell yeah, well, at the end of the day, the studio has to deliver. And if I want to pay people timely, I need to kick some asses, right? That's the, well, harsh truth of running a studio. Anyways, so back to Cluster. You started in 2015 and it ended up crashing in 2023, May 2023. That's what reads on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about the timeline. Like, what are your memories from that time, and when did it start? It's looking a little bit concerning. And what was the timeline of events?
Yeah, actually, first of all, the pandemic really hit hard, like everybody. So I survived that. But afterwards, the timeline was basically, I'll say probably 8 months prior to closing. It says May, but it's actually February.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, yeah, exactly. So, and then I saw a few articles. You could see that the economy was kind of weird, and I would notice articles about, big studios in California changing guards, like top level management being changed. And I was like, that's weird. And then I think it was August and September, they started, because of a performance of shares or whatever, they started cutting a lot of employees. So I was wary about that. And we talked about yesterday prior to this interview, I had a friend that was showing me AI with Midjourney, and that came into play. And I was like, what's going on? And at first, like I mentioned, like my first tests in Midjourney, I was like, we're good. We have 10 years. So basically that was September. And then contracts were a little bit scarce during that time, because basically at Cluster, we were also getting low-end shows, like sequences for big studios that were out of capacity because all the vendors and all the streamers were outputting crazy amount of like shows and series and films. So basically all the top level, like ILM, digital domain, whatever shows or whatever. So at one point it got down to us at Cluster on smaller sequences or shows. And again, I was more than happy to do that kind of work. So at one point we could feel that it's coming down a bit, and a few shows that didn't come in, that were supposed to come in on a certain date, were pushed, and suddenly you could feel everything being pushed. And so as a small studio, you're like, cash flow and stuff. And I was like, okay, something's happening really hard. So, and then in December, there was a show that we started to bid, which could have potentially have us pass through that particular storm. So when that went to another particular show, went to another studio, my brother was looking at the business side of things, and he's like, I think we're done. In terms of, I could have continued by myself, he said, Lord, but at one point after 8 years and it was a hard 8 years, but that's the business side of things, personal stuff, mentally speaking, the charge of having a studio is, as you know, it's not something that you go at night, ooh, that was fun. No, it's okay, next project, next this, how are we going to live? So there's a lot of mental stress that goes with having a business, and that goes for any field in general. So I think January or February, we didn't get that particular project. And then I said, okay, I'm done, because I had the fortunate event of making 2 kids while I was at Cluster. So I had 2 young ones. So basically I would work till 12 or 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and then go back home, and then the kids would wake up. So I would, take care of them for an hour or two. So went to bed at 3, wake up at 6. So I did that for a while. So it was a big strain on me health wise also. So that's why when everything wasn't going well, and the impending was it the writer's strike at first?
Yeah. Can't remember exact timeline, but
exactly,
more or less that timing.
So then when I heard that also, I went, okay, it won't work. And there was the other actors strike also being renegotiated, and the math wasn't computing anymore. There was too many outside factors for me to say, you know what, I'll carry on. And with AI, again, in September, I said, we're good for 10 years. Well, in January of that 2023, I said, okay, we're done. It's not happening. And it's kind of interesting because, again, I keep explaining to everybody I talk to about AI. The issue is it's a tool, the big problem is that there's no economy based off that new particular ecosystem because it's emerging. So it's not like, okay, an hour of AI, like let's say you're an architect, an hour is usually that rate or whatever. There's no like base business model with that particular new tool.
Well, for studios, for sure. For big tech, I have a stance on this, but
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
later.
Well, yeah, big tech is different than just on a service side. It's a different model. Yeah, so I decided in February to just close cluster. And then what hit me hard, so I got a job at, I think it was Pixelmondo. So the first day I got there, my dad went into the hospital. So I had to tell them, oh my God, I have to take a leave. 5 days later, he had a heart attack. So basically, I lost my dad
Jesus.
a month later. For me, life was going. And again, I say that like really, I was looking at, the sky saying, okay, I wanted to go right, do this and this and this and that. But life's like, you need to go the other way.
Mm,
And I just listen and stop fighting and say, okay, you know what? I'll regroup and we'll see what happens after. So
mm.
yeah.
Right. You seem very calm about it, and I'm not sure if that was the case almost 2 years ago when this happened. Do you remember the decision moment and like kind of emotions and feelings, if you don't mind
No,
sharing that?
actually, like I mentioned, I don't mind because it's part of the entrepreneur process. There's no way around it. Like I read articles, I read books, and I'm like, I did get all the ticks, checked because they talked about personal life, which is a big having the business because it's not like you start a business and oh my God, I make millions, after a week. It's usually not the case.
Mm,
So. So the one of the hardest part was firing, having to let not firing, but having to let go half of the team back in October of 2022, which was again because of the project that didn't come in. I had to let some of them go. Then I tried to keep half of the
yeah.
team going. And at the end of February, like I was disheartened by having to let go people because, like I mentioned a little bit too early in the interview, had my team. I was like, okay, this is a great number. We have a great throughput, and we'll only get better from there. So, yeah. So it was hard to let go of that because for 8 years I was like, I was basically going at it like 4,000%.
And that was the same team that you had more or less from the beginning, like really people that you nourished over the years, or that
No,
was,
actually, some were a few years in. Most of them were recent hire because the number of shots we had to output, I couldn't do everything myself, especially with kids at home. So it was a big decision for me to let go because I'm not somebody that gives up usually, but this was like it's not working and I couldn't see and I can't like I can see certain threads like working right now, but it's hard to maneuver in something as unknown as what's coming. So yeah.
no, you didn't have all the cards on the table at
No,
that time, right?
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
same here. Well, do you remember the day after? Like, the shit happened. You made the decision, you closed the company, you let the people go. What was the feeling? Did you feel lighter? Did you feel like on a hangover? Like, what was that for you?
Actually, I have to admit that I've kind of like pressed pause at that time. So I
Mm,
kept just so I could get a sense of getting like equipment sold or whatever. Like
ready.
I was on a survival mode, which I'm slowly coming out of now, but I, it was basically a lot of strain. And then again, my dad was in a mix. So basically I went
Yeah.
to, okay, I put myself aside and like did what it was required of me on all bases. Yeah, no, it's a hard, it's gut wrenching to actually have to close or do whatever. So yeah.
For sure, not easy. One thing that I reflected on is that, if you look at big tech and at new founders in tech industry and like tech bros kind of style and startups ecosystem and all this kind of things, what happens is that failure is absolutely normalized. It's part of the ethos, it's part of the game, and everybody knows that. But in the creative industry, the way I'm seeing it is that nobody talks about it. And this part of mentality is not there. There is no Silicon Valley startup founder mentality in the creative ecosystem. And people are so much invested in the work they do and in the companies they build. Because I believe like almost all of us, we build the companies the same way we build whatever we create, right? It's a child.
Yeah.
It's the best you can do, and it's not a business. You don't have a healthy business relationship with your company, which is something everybody should learn sooner.
Yep.
But anyways, so I think that talking about these things makes a lot of sense, because one of my ideas or reasons I'm doing that is to also normalize this kind of experience and make people aware that these things happen. That's the part of the game, that losing your business or closing your business is not necessarily a personal failure, although it's hard to separate it and often it feels so. But, well, it's good to have discussions about it.
Actually, I think you're right. And only entrepreneur in our field that went through what we went through can understand. Again, there was I think a video on Facebook that I saw, and it was one entrepreneur saying, it doesn't matter what business you're in. If you're an entrepreneur and you have employees and you had to pay people and you had to deliver stuff and whatever, you go through the same process, and it's an individual process which people can relate because it's the same strain on everybody. But you're right. People, especially in our creative industry, look at us like you failed. Frankly, I don't mind, because usually the person that says that to you is not even close of going through what you've been through. So I think there's a certain amount of respect that people that actually did the same path or almost the same path will have a mutual understanding of, hey, I understand what you went through. And I get that from other business owner in our field, because I know a lot of people that did that. And actually it made me reflect when I was a younger artist working with the owners of big studios, and I was, next to them. And to this day, I'm like, I should have asked, but I wasn't there in the process. But I have a big respect for those people. And also, it's kind of funny. It's a personal waking up moment. I work with which is a veteran, and also Scott Ross at Digital Domain, which now that I had my own VFX business, I'm like super admirative of their process. And then you look at what they did in the past, and I'm like, oh my God, it's actually crazy what they projects that I would watch as, a kid or whatever. I still feel like a kid at heart, even at my age, but it's what they went through is the same thing. It's a very hard field to be in.
Yeah. And, when you unfolded this story, I saw so many similarities to like the kind of my path and also my experiences. I think I ignored the signals about the upcoming downturn back in 2022. Generally, 2022 was a little bit slower, but we landed a massive project in the Middle East, and it kept us going until late autumn, I guess. There were a few other projects which came in early 2023. That was a moment like when I was at the peak, meaning the studio was very profitable for the last 2-3 years. We were doing mainly CG, so obviously we benefited from the post-COVID boom.
Yeah.
At the same time, I went through a hiring marathon, because end of 2022, beginning of 2023, it was still a time where it was so fucking hard to get people in and like really find.
Yeah.
So I finally made it. March 2023, I had a decent Australian producer. I had a team which was well greased. They'd done a bunch of projects together in the previous year, I had some juniors also or newcomers to the studio. And we were like, everything was in place to make the leap to the next level. And the ambitions were high. I mean, they were always high, but everything was in place to do that leap. And the leap, well, you said right, and the life took us left. So
Yeah.
very similar moment, but differently to you, I didn't have a hard stop with the company. I was launching another agency at that time, so I kept my team busy doing some other work, and then, well, they deserved a break, so they were happy to take some time off, and then it kind of faded, and I kept marketing and sales going until September 2023, and then I made a decision, okay, I did everything I could to secure projects. The projects didn't come. There is nothing else to do. So the market won.
I know. And it's sad because there was nothing you could have done more. Like it's the entire industry. I've never seen that in my 25 years of experience in the field, that kind of withdrawal and that kind of, basically it's the entire industry in a very, very, very short term that just dissolved.
Yeah.
I don't know, it just disappeared. It's an interesting reality.
It is. And at the same time, right now, because I spent the last 2 years analyzing what's going on in economy, in geopolitics, and in the industry, and all these factors, and I'm seeing very clearly one thing. I still do remember the crisis back in 2008. My digital agency was working at that time for financial sector. So, we went down overnight, but half a year later, we were back on track. We made a pivot, and my entire career is like switching lanes something like 7 times altogether, roughly every 4 or 5 years. That was always visual industry, a bit of marketing, branding, these kind of things. But looking at major chapters or brands or companies, that was 7 altogether. So that's the reality I was used to. And 2008 crisis was hard hitting. It was short, relatively short, but it was official. And what happened in 2022 is like, nobody talks about crisis, right? Some people maybe talk about problems in the creative industry or downturn or something like that. But the reality is that we have a massive crisis and nobody talks about it. It's not
No,
labeled. It's unofficial.
that's you said it. It's a very weird time, and it's kind of funny because you talk about like you changed lanes or you adapted yourself like 7 times throughout your company, and that's I think just the nature of the creative industry. It's not like we're selling a product. We're not selling let's say coffee mugs or whatever, which is a physical production, and once you get going, well, you have a certain revenue per month. It's a creative industry, so it's something that here's your coffee mug. Oh, it's $5. Yeah, it's $5. Oh, can I have it blue? Okay. Did you go back, make it blue, give it back, but you're still charging the same price in a lot of ways. So it's really hard to adapt to, especially like you said, we don't know what to call what's going on. Like here in Montreal, we went from 8,600, I think, VFX artists and creative industry employees to we're now down to 5,200.
You mean employed, hired?
Employed, hired in the big studios. Some
Mm-hmm.
studios have shut down in Montreal because of it. And it's forecast to go down to 2,000 something
Mm-hmm.
employees. So
So it's like
it's a very
quarter
scarce.
left. Yeah.
Yeah. And the expertise was there, the throughput was there. Everybody, I'm not the only one that didn't foresee what was going to happen, but it's sad to see an industry like that that's been built over the years just vanish. And not just from Montreal, the same thing happened to LA back in the day because of subsidies, and then other town, it depends on the government fund, which might call it subsidies. So there's so many factors. Right now, I think it's a very pivotal moment because of the arrival of AI into the mix. I think it's going to get things to change quite a bit over the next few years.
Yeah. And it's, to me, it's concerning. It's definitely, well, I don't want to sound negative, but I'm not seeing really optimistic outlook for the future. And the whole thing with AI that you mentioned is you mentioned the lack of business model for the creative companies. I totally agree with that. Unfortunately, the bigger picture is, well, the reality of the big tech crusade against the creative industry, to put it that way. And, you mentioned AI is a tool, and I totally agree, but usually that tool was in a hand of a craftsman. And what's happening right now is you have a discounted hammer, but there is no craftsman to operate it. And that's a little bit unfortunate, but that's what the industry is buying. There will be a reaction to that, and there will be work for highly skilled craftsmen and artists and like really experienced people. That's in my estimate, that's going to be, the top 5, 10, maybe 15% of the entire industry. But definitely that doesn't look promising to majority of people who made their living doing creative things. So that's what I'm seeing. Curious
It's
how you see these things.
no, it's probably it's almost the same. It's just it's evolving at such a speed. Again, every time I'm saying like in my head, like, oh, in 2 years we're gonna 6 months in, done. Now it's every 2 weeks that I see massive progress, and I'm like, it's like you're mentioning cards. It's like having your deck of cards, and people are changing it as you're. Hey, wait a minute, what's going on? But that's what's happening. So I'm looking at the future in a very taking time to myself to actually rest and try to foresee and not force things, because things are constantly moving. And again, every 2 weeks, everything's evolving. There's still, an element that, and I'm a true believer of that, is I think there's a certain energy you get while, making a movie where all the
Yeah.
participants kind of put nice energy in the images we're outputting. I think there's a very human thing to it. I think right now I see AI more as a tool versus an actual production method for now. Don't quote me on that, but it'll change. But it's again the human side of making movies. It's magical. It's too bad that it's being disrupted the way it is right now, because a lot of good people were affected by the pandemic and then the strikes, and now LA fires. Productions are stopping because of that. So can we just have a break? It's like, because a lot of LA friends are either without a house or affected or unemployed because of all the massive studio change. Like again, top tier studio change is a big factor also. So, and again, all the entrepreneurs that are out there, like actually still making VFX and people still making movies. Kudos to you guys, and thanks for holding up the industry in this particular environment, because it's not the golden age of oh, I have an idea for a show on Netflix, and whoo, it just happens.
Uh,
We're not there, and it's just sad because families also are being affected by all these changes. So it's yeah.
you are right. That's correct. There is one more thing I wanted to get back to,
Sure.
because you mentioned the moment when you closed the studio and you didn't say a burnout, so you didn't use that word, but I had a feeling there was a weight to
Yeah.
to
It
to that, to the heritage and to the what you've been through over the 8 years, if that was 8 years or something like that, right?
Yep.
How do you see
Actually,
that?
reflecting in hindsight, I think I did two burnouts, physical and mental burnouts. I just didn't acknowledge them. I just pushed through. I did two moments. I actually was like, I'm, uh, I'm out.
And that was before you closed the company, so
Oh,
like
yeah.
you have undergone them and kept the company running, right?
Oh, yeah. Because, lack of sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Again, mentioned that I had two newborns at the same time. So it's all those factors that just added up: the stress of the company, the money in and out, what was coming in or out, especially at the beginning, and then put in the personal family life that was all mixed together. It's a very rough circumstances. Like in hindsight, I should have waited for them to be older. But again, I'm laughing now because I think I've accepted that big piece of my life. The learning experience was amazing in terms of I saw where I could go in terms of personal mental strength. I know where I can go in terms of, I know the effect of the financial burden and situation that as a company actually brings to you. I know how, if I were to restart today, the lessons I've learned through that 8 years is, you can't learn that anywhere because it's a very personal experience, even though it's financial and people seeing it as a business and it's a separate. No, it's when you start a company, it's a mix of all those areas in your life. So yeah.
Gotcha. Well, for me, that was a little bit different because the last chapter, the last company was like going really well and really fast. And yes, I did work my ass off for 7 years straight or something like that. But at the same time, I was, I was on the constant high because of the adrenaline and, the caliber of projects that were hitting us. And, every new project was better and bigger and the budgets doubled and tripled. And
That's awesome.
all of a sudden, it's like exponential growth finally after 15 or 20 years in a business. And so that keeps you going and that keeps you, I guess, ignoring what are the expenses of doing that and like how much do you have to pay for that. And this is something I learned that, and everything's got a cost, right? Everybody who's got something and who's in the spotlight, there is a cost that you are not seeing that this person paid, no matter what. And like seeing this cost, or at least being aware of that and imagining that, this is one of the probably greatest lessons that couldn't be learned otherwise.
Exactly. And you're right. And that's why I say it's a very personal adventure. And you need to again, you're your own cheerleader in that. So every night I'm like, hey, another day, reset, start over the next day. And you get like this, but it's hard to let go. But I think usually it's the bounce back from there. I think life was trying to, on my side, to actually say, hey, slow down, relax, instead of like trying to control and I'm going over there. It should be easier. You're part of the equation. If your physical side is not being taken care of, like there's always something pulling. It's like it's personal, it's financial, it's the balance of all of those. And if you pull too much toward, there's something that brings you back in general. Like from the books I've read and other stuff, I'm like, okay, you know what? I've just went through whatever entrepreneur just goes through in general.
Well, I think ultimately this is one thing worth keeping in mind is that we have only so much under our control and the market wins no matter what, right? You can tick all the boxes and you can be really good and really committed and ambitious and all these kind of things. But, ultimately the market says so, you have nothing to say.
Yeah.
So, and I don't want to sound opportunistic or anything like that, or it's I was always the man to go through the grind and to push and, driven by crazy ambition, which by the way, I recently learned is a form of aggression. Very interesting perspective. So anyways, you learn that the market wins. And I guess that's the reality many companies are facing. So I don't know. My main takeaway from all this is that do your best. When it's over, it's over. It's a business failure. Businesses, get born and die and you live your life, right?
Yep.
It's not a personal failure. It's not your fault or not all your fault, all these kind of things. So that's my main share for people that are going through this stuff. What's yours? What could you add to that?
Actually, my take was like, and I learned that by observing, because I was always observing, the owners of the company since I started or the leadership in place. And basically for me, a company is a party boat. You invite employees on to party. And at one point, you just either you sing or you continue on, but it's an adventure of, a boat having people on it, and it's an adventure, and that's it. Like I know a lot of people doing startups, and they did, since I started Cluster, they did they try to start 3 different companies. So it's a process.
Right.
You need to be in tune with yourself and say, hey, that's what happened, and what's next. And that's, I think, the most important. Like right now, I want to take this 2025 year to actually relax and take time for myself, because again, I've burned the candle on too many fronts in the past 2-3 years and slash 8 years. But it's a question of like, hey, I'm gonna take time for myself and see if I start something else, or I just go freelance, or I meet new people. Like I just want to go out there and relax a bit.
Live the life you didn't have time for, probably.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, righty. I guess same here. Although, for me, the most difficult part was like what happened following the closing of my company. And I'm in a fortunate or in a good situation. Well, it's all earned. It didn't come from nothing, but I'm financially secure and stable. So I didn't really, after I made the decision that I'm not running my company anymore, I had plenty of runways. So that's fine. But at the same time, I was 40 and I had a lot of juice and I was revved up. I wanted to work. And guess what? It has never been that hard. So that's a new experience. And that's something which was probably the most difficult, like willing to work and not being able to really get things off the ground, right?
Yeah, it's tough, and I'm very sympathetic to what you've been through, because I remember you reaching out, and we were like touching base once in a while, and I was looking at you, and the visuals your company was creating were through the roof. I was like really impressed with your reels and stuff. And again, even though, and that's, I think, one of the lessons that really humbled me is, even though you're making great stuff, well, a company can fold like that. It's I keep referring back to what Rhythm and News lived through.
Yeah.
And you're like, they win the Oscar while the company is falling. And it's, again, I don't think it's I think it's the outside event that made this pressure on it, because I remember a day where they needed to ramp up like 100 or 200 people in one company to actually handle like 2 to 3 big movies at the same time, which I find were the best years of my life, like being at Digital Domain and working with those great people. I really had fun over there, because it was, after like 2-3 shows, you could feel and eye caliber people outputting. I was the new kid on the block, or at least I felt like that. And I was like, oh my God, this guy worked on Fifth Element, and oh my God, they worked on Titanic. And I was, and they don't know this, but I was a big fan of most of my coworkers, because again, like it for me and Patrick, I think it's the big lesson was, again, it's about the people, and that's what's disheartening right now, is people losing their job, and they're good people, but meeting people from all around the world and having like this same throughput to actually make a movie. And I remember one person told me, how do I negotiate salary? And I can't remember who told me or where I read it, but I always live by those 3 rules. You either get a job for the project, the money, or the team. And at Digital Domain, for me, at one point, it was all 3 all together, and it was magic. Like I had a blast. It was super fun, and again, people. That's the only thing that stays with you, is the people. Like right now, being remote and all, I do love the flexibility of being remote, and that's why I usually, if there's work, I usually go in 4 to 5 days a week for sure, because I want to meet people. Like I kept hearing horror stories where some person came in, got hired, but it was all remote, and then got fired, but nobody knew what
Yeah.
happened, versus
Yeah.
in person. And there's energy, you need to actually feel those people.
Yeah, right. That's such a good point, because obviously if you look at the creative industry, people go there by choice. And you could think that these are probably the most lucky people on earth, because they can do work which, they make a living on, but at the same time it's probably one of the most fulfilling kinds of work. And all of a sudden, if you take all that personal and community aspect of things, which happens when you're working together, you have relationships in company, and when you guys all pull everything together for that big show at the end of the day, if you remove that, it just becomes a job like every other one, like every other, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge loss, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyways, to end on a positive note, I love what you said about the most fulfilling times, and I wouldn't also trade my career for anything else.
I would, Patrick. It's like wearing the scouts like badges. Like you
Yeah.
get elected and you have a lot, but unfortunately, nobody not care, but nobody understands, what we've been through. So it's personal.
We could probably go for many hours more, but we just hit an hour mark. Let's cut it here, Marc. It's been a huge pleasure for me to speak with you after all these years and hear
Yeah,
your story. And I appreciate your vulnerability and you're willing to share it with others. I believe that there are great lessons in all these stories. We should have more of them.
yeah. Feel free to contact me. I love talking about entrepreneurship, and congrats on everything you accomplished, Patrick.
Same to you, man.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.